Hello, everyone. Um, Good evening. My name is Clarence White, for those of you who don't know me. For another couple of hours, I am the Associate Director here at the Eastside Freedom Library. So thank you for coming. I have no sense of humor, so. All right. Yes. So thank you for being here on a Sunday evening. I know that it isn't always convenient, but there are reasons to come out. And so thank you for filling these seats. As I said, this is my last event in my current position. I'll be introducing one other event next month. Oh, well, I'll miss you. But I'll be back here. Yeah, I'll be around. I won't be far. So, but yeah, I mean, I agreed to do this event, for lots of reasons. I should be home getting ready and doing my homework, but I am here, and there's a good reason. So much about our guest tonight fit into so much of the work that this library has done over the past more than a decade, as all of you well know. And I'm glad you're here to celebrate that, but also to add to a discussion and a building narrative of what our society not only needs to be, but needs to talk about. I'm going to do a very, somewhat brief introduction of our guests. Pelle Dragstad is a member of the Danish Parliament and leader of the Red-Green Alliance, and has written this book to share with us that has met a lot of great acclaim. And I think he is, as a gift to us, talking to people around this country about just the way that we need to talk about what we are seeing today in our politics, which is not new, and it's not just the past decade. Very much it is more of what we are built on than we want to admit, and it is somewhat precarious as we see now. To introduce our other guest, I want to tell a story. So I teach the first year experience class at Minneapolis College. And for some reason, I asked, maybe it's because I work here. It's definitely because I work here. I asked my students where we got the 2-day weekend. And one of them popped up and said, oh, it was Henry Ford. Yeah, and when no one in the class laughed. But I sort of, in my head, not visibly, did one of those, it's like, but I said, okay, where did you come up with that information? And he said, well, I just Googled it. And so we spent the next half hour talking about, how does Google work? You know, it's going to pull the things that are most familiar. And it's going to give you the answer that someone else wants you to have. But then I talked about the people that I've been working with for the past 7.5 years and the scholarship that they do. And I said, okay, I am a misfit in the MBA world, but my master's degree is in business administration. My father said, that doesn't really sound like you. And he was right. But I endured and I got through it. But one thing I know is that businesses work to maximize shareholder wealth. And you don't give away anything to your employees for free. And this was well before the, I would like the life-work balance and holistic worker. No, I want you on the assembly line doing that repetitive stress activity. And I said, okay, think about the time period. What was happening? Well, what was happening is all of the people who were supplying the steel for his cars were going on strike. out east, the mills were going on strike. But I also told them about Gary Kunaunen's book, Flames of Discontent, that talks about what was happening in northern Minnesota. All of those Finns were going on strike. They were shutting down the mines, and Henry Ford had two choices because he didn't want his assembly line to slow down because that was going to cost him a lot of money, and he wanted more money, of course. He could, in my mind, done one of two things. He could have sent a bunch of trains down south and loaded them with black people who would have come up and worked for half the price, because this is like 100 years ago in the South, more than 100 years ago in the South. Or he could give his workers something. And what is he going to do to keep the assembly line from shutting down? Well, how about a 2-day weekend? So, one of the great things about this place is that we have cataloged and shelved over 40,000 books. Almost all of them shelved by my colleague David here. So this Tetris has been created by David. There's a lot of knowledge in those books, but we don't have all the books, and the books don't have all the stories because it is a gate-kept industry, publishing is. So sometimes we have to create more books and tell other stories that are outside of those pages. And I think today we're doing a little bit of both. And I'm grateful that at least my last days in this position are being filled with the telling of some of that story. So, Pelle and Gary, would you like to come and take your seats? Who's going to sit on which side? But thank you very much for coming and agreeing to do this. We appreciate it a lot.
Okay, thank you. Greetings from Minnesota's Iron Range. I was there just a couple hours ago. Let me just do a little test of the audience here. An injury to one is? An injury to all. We're in good company. Yeah. Okay. So going to run some basic questions here to get to know the book a little bit better, get to know Pelle a little bit better. And we want to save time, of course, for questions at the end. And so you will have, if I don't get to one of your questions, which is highly likely, then you'll have some time at the end. And I think that's one of the things that we're most looking forward to. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so we want to say greetings and welcome to Minnesota. Have you ever been here before?
First time.
First
but
time.
I'm thrilled to be here. I think, the idea of Minnesota having this kind of Nordic influence and history, of course, makes it even more exciting to be here. And but also Minnesota having this rich culture of social struggles for social justice is something that really is exciting for me. And even now learning that Nordic workers played a crucial part in some of those struggles is, of course, something that makes me as a Nordic a little bit proud of that. And then in the end, of course, also that looking at the states, maybe this particular state is the closest we have to something just resembling a little bit a welfare society with a little bit better healthcare insurance, as I understand it, and of course also some really important achievements like this free school meal. We're still fighting for that. So it's interesting, and of course that I'm sure that has to do with your culture and your history of social struggles, because as Clarence said, nothing comes out of nothing. Everything comes out of struggle and resistance. So I'm really excited to be here with you, and thank you so much for this fine library for hosting the event.
Yeah. I'm also obliged as a Minnesotan to say, please come back again. Okay, so you got into it a little bit, and let's just talk a little bit about especially in this case, the Danish parliamentary system and the Red-Green Alliance that you're a part of. Will you do a little bit of explanation on how that might differ from what we have in the States, but also what your party is or your alliance is advocating for?
Yeah, I will try to do it briefly. I'm a politician, so I could talk about that for an entire hour. But okay, so as you know, Denmark, our political system is really different from the American one. We have a multi-party system. We have parliamentarism, meaning that we have an election, and after that, the majority in the parliament can form a government. So in order to be prime minister, you need the support of a majority in the parliament of the parties. So we have never had one party rule. It has always been coalition. And historically, it has always been a left wing. You have the opposite with red and blue as we have. But okay, so it has always been either a kind of left bloc going from the Social Democrats, sometimes a Social Liberal Party, and to the left, including my party, or a right-wing bloc. So normally that's the case, and normally that has meant that when the Social Democrats are governing, they are dependent on the votes of my party and some other left-wing parties. We are 3 left-wing parties to the left of the Social Democrats. So, for example, when they need to do their national budget, they need to sit down and negotiate with my party, and we, of course, use that power to get advances for working people, for welfare, for climate. I can go more into the specifics of what we have achieved. But for example, last time in the last election cycle, we succeeded in getting free dental care for young people. We had succeeded in getting a climate law that was at that time the most radical in the world. We achieved getting rents freezed, unfortunately only for a couple of years because of the inflation. So that's kind of how we as a party seek influence at the national level. Right now we have a special situation in Denmark because the Social Democrats formed the government with the right, and it's a majority government, which is really unusual in Denmark. Normally the government needs to negotiate with parties outside government, but now they can kind of just carry through with whatever they want. And for example, the first thing they did in this government, which made them really unpopular, was taking away a holiday. So they just abolished the holiday. And this holiday was also a part of the collective agreement system. So for the first time, more or less in Danish history, they kind of by law altered collective agreement. So the trade union movement is quite strong in Denmark and historically tied to the Social Democrats. They are really pissed, if I may say so. So that's more or less how it's going and how the situation is. Regarding kind of correlation of forces, historically the Social Democrats have been the big party on the left, but right now when we are looking to the polls, the 3 parties to the left of the Social Democrats, we are polling around 25%, and they are polling around 20 to 22. So if that would be the election result, that would be quite historic. So we have this kind of left turn right now among the Danish population. We see a little bit the same going on in Sweden and Norway. So so that's the situation. We'll have an election coming up latest November 26, and we hope to get a new majority where the left wing is stronger and is able to kind of force the Social Democrats to take a left wing turn in order to, because this kind of centrist the Social Democrats in Denmark is not kind of classic Social Democrats. They're not a reformist party. They don't have a kind of socialist perspective. So they're a centrist party which has carried through a lot of neoliberal reforms during the last decades. But still, when they're in coalition with us, we're able to get important achievements. So even that we have strong opposition to many of their policies, not least migration policies. As you maybe know, the Danish Social Democrats is kind of the most hardliner on migration among the European Social Democrats. So that's a major obstacle also for us working together with them. Of course, we have opposed all that anti-migration policies, but they have a big majority with the right-wing parties. So that makes it difficult to us to roll back what they have done. But we can, when they need our support, we can avoid that they do new attacks on kind of migrants and So that would be a maybe not that short introduction to Danish politics.
Okay. Well, I would imagine it's hard to boil that down into about 5 minutes. So the title of the book is Nordic Socialism, The Path Toward a Democratic Economy. And so I'm a historian by trade, so I have a genetic compulsion to ask about context. So in the book, you refer to it as a path. So where did that path begin? Could you give kind of an idea of, was it post-World War II, or how did the modern left in Danish culture and society, when did it appear and when did it become popular?
Maybe I should say that I use the term Nordic socialism, which I, by the way, stole from Donald Trump. I will get back to it. It was his administration that coined this term. We'll get back to it. I use it both kind of descriptively to say something about the Nordic societies as they are today and as they were even more. And I use it kind of normative in trying to form a term that could describe the kind of socialism that I would like us to develop, not only in the Nordics, but in the world. So, but when you talk about kind of the historic trace of that, well, there's kind of two origins of what I call Nordic socialism. One is the co-op movement, the movement of cooperatives, which has been really strong in Denmark. That didn't originate from the left or from the working class left. It originated from the rural kind of democracy liberals. So 150 years ago, more or less, the small farmers and peasants began to create their own dairies, slaughterhouses, grocery stores, and it was described like a wave from Jutland because it was so fast that they took over a whole big part of the economy as a cooperative economy. At that time, the peasantry was fighting for having voting rights, for democracy. We were a monarchy at that time, not as advanced as the US at that time. And so at that time it was logic for a lot of people that they fought for democracy on the political level. And therefore it was logical that when they formed enterprises, of course they should be governed with out of the same principles. So the cooperative movement formed this democratic, non-profit enterprises that kind of took over the whole agricultural sector and still dominates it today. The working class was a little bit, and the socialist movement in the start was a little bit hesitant. They were afraid of, worker ownership of enterprises would turn workers into petty capitalists. So they kind of wanted, why take the bread when you can get the whole bakery? Do you use the same term in English? Yeah, okay, yeah. So, but in the end, they, inspired by the peasant movement, began also to form co-ops. So we have a really rich tradition of democratic common ownership in not only in agriculture. Our utilities today are dominated totally by co-op or municipalities, but mostly co-ops in water, heating, electricity is owned by co-ops. Our second biggest grocery chain, Co-op, the name is Co-op also, it's owned by 1.7 million consumers. There's no Jeff Bezos making gains when we do our grocery stores in that chain, at least. If we look at our housing sector, 1 in every 5 housing units are owned by a national network of co-ops. It is not kind of single house co-ops. It's a kind of organization, national organization, that means that you can get money for building new co-ops at a really low rate because it's a collective system. But then when you have paid your debt, you pay some of your rent going into that same foundation in order to do new housing. So, and you cannot, as a co-op member, claim any of the wealth, housing. The prices of housing goes up, but that does not go in the pocket of the members, but stays in the community. Even in our financial sector, we have a strong presence of credit unions. I know you also have that in here, but also mortgage. Mortgage, until only 30 years ago, we did not have commercial mortgage lenders in Denmark. Everything was cooperatively owned or state funds. So thinking of that today is kind of incredible. Mortgage lending is kind of the core of modern capitalist society or economy. But it's only so few years ago. And still our biggest mortgage lenders is a co-op. So that is kind of one of the... So the cooperative movement took a big part of the economy, as I describe it, and we'll get back to that, kind of out of capitalism. So it was a sector in the economy without capitalists, and of course they were acting in a market, but in certain way in the agricultural sector they had kind of all. It was not only the dairies, it was a production of fertilizers, it was export, the import, they made their own cement factories. Everything around agriculture was in a kind of demarketized cooperative sector. So that was one of the kind of most important, one of the elements in what I call the democratic economy of Denmark and of the Nordics. As you would know, Finland has a really strong cooperative sector also. The other one, of course, was the building of the welfare state. So from the First World War, and especially in the post-Second World War decades, we built up this welfare states that essentially was about decommodifying even more sectors of the economy. Decommodifying, if people are not familiar with the term, is kind of just changing something that was a commodity, something you had to buy in a marketplace, into a social right. And in my eyes, decommodification is one of the most important kind of socialist advances, because not only do you democratize, because our hospitals, our educational system, our daily care, child care, elderly care is governed by us or by people that we elect, not by capitalists. But most importantly, as normal persons, as working families and persons, we are not dependent as much as a market or our purchasing power for fulfilling our most basic needs, like healthcare. For people in Denmark, it's really hard to understand the meaning of the kind of private healthcare system, insurance system that you're having in the United States. The idea, for example, being dependent on your employer for having access to healthcare is just, it's quite obvious that creates a dependence. The right-wing pundits is always talking about that there's kind of a trade-off between welfare and a big state and then individual freedom. But in the real world, it is quite obvious that, for example, when you have healthcare as a right, you are less dependent, you are more free. You can, for example, quit your job if your boss is a jerk. And I could give a lot of examples how welfare is a freedom machine, in my eyes, quite contrary of what the right-wing libertarians are trying to argue. So these two sectors is kind of what I call the democratic economy. as opposed to kind of the capitalist economy. So an important key message of my book, and I know we'll get back to that, is that we should the left normally has this idea of that either we have capitalism or we have socialism. So today, capitalism is kind of everything. We're living in a capitalist society, we have a capitalist economy, we have a capitalist market. Some would even say we are capitalist beings. And then socialism is something that we'll kind of have to wait for until we kind of abolish capitalism and we can build it from the ashes. What I argue in my book is that this is not the smartest way of understanding socialism and capitalism and societal change. Instead, we should understand that all societies, all economies are in fact kind of hybrids. Of course, that depends on how you define capitalism. But if you define capitalism, and I think it, of course, that's a thin definition, but I think it's the core of capitalism is the relation of exploitation. So capitalism is a social relation where capital owners owning companies and banks and today all kind of platforms are extracting wealth from the work of other people or from the social activities of other people. But if you use that definition of capitalism, it's quite obvious that in every society, in every economy, you have a lot of social relations and even economic activities and production going on in another framework that is not capitalist. This Freedom Library, for example, is providing services that could be provided on a private basis, but it's in a I don't know if it's a democratic framework. If you choose, I don't know enough about this institution, but a credit union, for example, a mutual insurance company, all these places where there are no capitalist owners and where decisions, or at least the ones governing, are someone that we can change by a democratic election. So by accepting that capitalism is not total, we can kind of identify all the places in our societies where we already kind of have the building blocks for creating and developing a democratic economy. And that's kind of the idea of the path towards a democratic economy, is saying, not least in the Nordic countries, for I would argue that the Nordic countries, at least in the Western world, are the economies, the most socialist economies. So what I claim and argue in the book is that instead of defining economies as either socialist or capitalist, we should define them as more or less capitalist and more or less socialist. And I think also that makes it much easier to understand, for example, the difference between the economy of the United States and of the Nordics. Because of course we can call both countries capitalist, because we are also an economy dominated by capitalist relations and ownership. But it's quite obvious that our countries and the possibilities, the freedoms, security of working people are so different. And why? Because the Nordics are more socialist than the US. So what I essentially suggest in the book is to accept that. I will see if I have convinced you. And if you are convinced, then my suggestion would be to build on that, to broaden out the democratic ownership, to strengthen the institution we already have, to create new ones, and thereby kind of changing the relations. So my end goal, I would say, would be to get to an economy where socialist or democratic ownership models is as dominant as the capitalist ownership models is in the present economy. So the second half of the book is just kind of concrete suggestions on how to do that in specific sectors. But I will get back to that, I think, Gary.
Yeah. And so, talking about what makes Nordic socialism, you have 5 principles. We won't go over them all, but the 2 that stood out to me was this idea of radical democracy. So what's the radical part of that democracy? You've discussed that some of the social reforms and the welfare state allow people to have a more democratic say in their social lives. How did that become part of the Danish political process?
I think the radical democracy is mostly kind of a normative wish. I don't think that we have a radical democracy in Denmark. I think that the parliamentarian system that we're having with multi-party system, a very low threshold for getting elected, only 2% of the votes, and you get to the parliament, and so on, is good. But for me, a real democracy should, of course, be on the political side much more not kind of taking away the parliamentarian system we have today, but for example, only 20 years ago our universities were democratically governed. They are not anymore. Our schools and so on. So I want a radical democracy in the way that people should be able to take decisions in all the kind of spaces where we are, and of course, most of all, that our workplaces and the economy as such should be democratized. And that, as I see it, is kind of the core idea of socialism, is kind of taking the principles of democracy, one person, one vote, and apply that to the economy and to the workplace as far as it's possible. But I think what is important for me about saying that it's that a Nordic socialist model should be a radical democracy is, we have really bad experiences with people calling themselves socialist that tried to democratize the economy or by nationalization and by state ownership of the entire economy. And I think it's quite obvious that experience went really bad. And some leftish people have this idea of, no, but if just Trotsky has won instead of Stalin, or if just Soviet had been a more advanced economy with more proletarians instead of small peasants, everything would have been different. But I think that's far too easy. We have to learn from what actually they were principled socialists, wanted to create socialism and a better life for their population, but they didn't have that. And why? For me, one lesson at least is that the idea of state ownership of the economy is not viable, because state ownership of the economy will lead to it's quite funny, because if you read the text from Marx, but also actually Lenin, they are talking about a stateless society, that the state should wither away. But in their kind of quest to achieve that, they created one of the most omnipotent states in world history, with an entire class of bureaucrats. So when I talk about radical democracy, that would be that we need an economic model where power is decentralized much more. And that's why I'm so inspired by the cooperative movement. It's not that I don't want public ownership. I think important sectors of the economy should be public ownership, like healthcare, education, utilities could also be that. But in the Nordics, or at least in Denmark, we have this strong experience of cooperative ownership that functions really well. So radical democracy would be that people, in fact, have influence. In Eastern Germany, they called all their companies Volkseigener Betrieb. That means people's own factories. But people didn't feel that it was a factory. So when the system broke down, fortunately, and capitalists took over the enterprises, there were almost no protests at all. There was some in Poland, some in Slovenia, but in Eastern Germany I haven't heard of even one big protest against it, because people didn't feel that it was their companies. If they had felt that, they would have fought against some shareholder or capital fund taking over their company, but they didn't. For them, it was just a change of bosses. So the radical democracy is about how to create. It's so easy for us on the left to say we should socialize ownership. It's a slogan, but when we start to ask ourselves how, who should be the owners, who should take the decisions, then all the difficult questions arises. And my book is essentially a contribution to try to answer that questions, because if we want to take socialism seriously, and I really want to, I think, maybe this Polish Jewish socialist Rosa Luxemburg said once that we have two options: barbarism or socialism. And I really think that the very moment that we're in now is kind of close to that prophecy, because I can't see, when I look to the US, for example, it's hard for me to see who can challenge the right-wing populism of Trump. The centrists won't do it. They can't do it, because they are also dependent on billionaire money and what I in my book called oligarchic power. So the only impulse for creating this alternative for working people would be from the left and from socialists. But then we need to be able to answer all the hard questions. We cannot just say, no, we should go for socialism. In my book I have this, I don't know if it's the best kind of picture, but I use the idea of going to the moon. So I, for example, when I try to convince someone of socialism, it would be like, okay, I'm going to the moon, do you want to come? Okay, it sounds a little bit dangerous. Have you tried it before? Yeah, and it went wrong every single time. Okay, have you thought about how we'll live in the moon? No, but we found out on the way. That's kind of the way the left have been arguing for socialism, and that's obvious that people don't buy it. So we need practical answers, and that's why I really think that the idea of learning from experience, not this idea of sitting in a basement with a lot of cigars and planning how this beautiful socialist society should be, but instead kind of building on experiences that we know works. This library works. It is delivering services every day to a community without profits. It works. And it can be, and that kind of practices can be scaled. Maybe the Spanish worker cooperative Mondragon, one of the most renowned cooperatives in the world, it's the fifth biggest employer in Spain. 80,000 worker members. They have more than I think 100 different companies in their kind of. Every single company is a democracy. The corporation as such is a democracy. So it's possible. It functions. The welfare state functions. Our healthcare system is public. It's a complex system. So why shouldn't we be able to have a public bank or a public or a cooperative factory of coffee or whatever? It's not. We know that it functions. We can point to it, and that's kind of what I really try to do in the book. Learn from history, not only in the Nordics, but also in other parts of the world. Unfortunately, not so much in the global South, which is could be a reasonable critique of my book, that it's a little bit Eurocentric, because in Latin America has really a rich history of cooperatives, and I think that the most cooperative dense area in the world would be Kerala in India, where I think 1 in every 8 of the workforce works in a co-op or something like that. So we could learn a lot from that also. I think. Yeah.
So in the book, you talk about 10 reforms towards what you're discussing here. We've taken a look at expanding the democratic sector, which are co-ops. And then there's some new ways of doing public ownership. But the one that I would like you to talk a little more about is this modern funds. And the reason for that is because it's anti-oligarchy, right? And so one of my favorite current U.S. politicians hates oligarchs. I think we all probably all know who that is. And so you reference Bernie Sanders many times in the book here. So what is this approach in modern funds, the FUNDS, that is going to get rid of them damn oligarchs?
Yeah, I would say that all the reforms that I suggest in the book is about fighting oligarchy. In the book, I use the term oligarchic power. So a claim in the book is that it's not that kind of we're living in an oligarchy. Maybe you're close to it in the US, but in all kind of capitalist countries, my claim is that we have two sources of power. One is a democratic power. That's the one that you delegate when you vote for a local or a national election, or when you vote for in your local credit union or cooperative or sports club or wherever where the person's taking the decision have a democratic mandate and can be changed by us. That's democratic power. Oligarchic power is the power that don't have any democratic mandate. So oligarchic power would be the power of the billionaires supporting Cuomo in the New York election, with millions of dollars to avoid Soren from getting elected in the primaries. And in capitalist society, there will be a constant rivalry between democratic power and oligarchic power. And unfortunately, there's a kind of vicious circle, because when you have this oligarchic power, they will use it to get their politician elected. And those politicians will use their power to make this group even wealthier, and then they can use more money on getting their way. So all what I suggest in the book, all reforms, is about kind of countering oligarchic power. And a key message in the book is that it is not enough with redistribution, but because that's an important lesson from the Nordics, that we redistribute by taxes. But what we did in the years where working class parties were dominant and strong was to challenge ownership more broadly, and that meant that a lot of economic power still was in the hands of the capitalist class or the economic elite, or you can use whatever word you want. And when the oil crisis hit in the 70s, after 3 decades of kind of worker dominance, and we had unemployment at about 20%, they hit back. The capitalist class hit back, and they attacked and rolled back a lot of the achievement that generations of trade unions and working class parties did. So, and because they still maintain the oligarchic power. So just to explain the term. So everything I suggest in the book is this. So the funds. Okay, in the 70s in Denmark and Sweden, a lot of we have gotten really far, and the Social Democrats and the trade union movement said, okay, we have achieved political democracy. We have achieved some kind of social democracy by this decommodification and the building of the welfare state. But what we still need is economic democracy. And one very, very famous Swedish social democratic economist called Rudolf Meidner, he said, as long as the capitalists are still having the ownership, they will have a gun pointed to the head of the workers' movement. A famous quote from him. So they started to think about how can we democratize ownership. And I think, as I said, the cooperative is a good way, especially you can do all kind of reforms to support cooperative. For example, we have made a law now in Denmark that if you are an owner of a small or middle-sized company and you sell it to your workers, then you don't need to pay the what do you call it? the tax that you pay for I don't know what's the name in English. Yeah, sales tax maybe. So you can do that, but the problem is that the big corporations, kind of the shareholder-owned corporation, they don't kind of change hands. They are kind of institutions. Yeah, so they don't have a single owner. They maybe have a dominant owner, but it is not kind of changing hands, and it's really difficult to democratize it. So the idea of wage earner funds was kind of a response of the Nordic labor movement to that. So what they suggested was a simple idea. Every big company with, I think it was more than 100 or 200 workers, should pay a tax of 2% each year. But the special about this tax was that it could only be paid in shares. So they had to kind of, what do you call it when you produce more shares? And those shares should be placed in funds controlled by the workers. In the Danish model, the funds were controlled by the trade union movement, which was, in my view, a bad idea because it made it really distant for the workers in the factory. So I think these funds should be kind of tied to one workplace in a system. I can go more into detail, but the idea is that the law that was actually voted for in government in Denmark, in parliament, would have meant that in 1990, all Danish companies would have been have worker majority in their ownership. So of course, if that law had passed, it would have been a totally different economy. In Sweden, they passed a law in a really, what do you call it, downwarded version. And unfortunately, when the right wing came to power 10 years after, the first thing, of course, that they did was to abolish these funds. And the problem, as I said, was that the workers themselves didn't really had so much to. They didn't have a kind of what do you call dividend. So actually, Bernie Sanders he took up the idea, and it was with reference to the Meitner plan. Also, the Corbyn campaign did the same. So they put forward this proposal of making this kind of tax that should step by step let the workers take over the ownership of big companies. And I think that's a really important reform. Of course, also one of the most difficult reforms because capital will fight it with everything that they had. In Sweden, when they passed a law, they had the biggest demonstration, I think, ever in the world from the employer side. So employers were marching in the streets, and they used billions of kroner to counter it. But actually, it was passed in Denmark, and that's really troubling. There was the Social Democrats want to do the law, but the hard left voted against it. The communists and the new left parties, because it was not radical enough. Sometimes the left is our own worst enemy, also today.
Yeah, and something works when when the new party comes in, the first thing they want to change is the thing that works the best.
Yeah, and I think
it had a target on it. It had a target on its back as soon as.
But I think if you make the model where the workers have a dividend every year, it will be almost impossible to roll back. So that was kind of lacking in the model that they did in Sweden, and then so the control was in the funds and the money went to the funds, but there was not a personal dividend to the individual worker, and I think that would be a really important way to avoid it getting abolished by the next right-wing administration.
Okay, one last question before we open up things to your questions, and this one is from number 9. It just fascinated me. Democratic donut planning, because it sounds delicious. So what does that entail?
Well, I have talked a lot about ownership because I really think that ownership is the key to changing power relations in a society and to kind of counter oligarchic power and make democratic power instead. So, but of course, there's another elephant in the room from a socialist perspective, and that is the market. So, for some socialists, market relation is kind of the defining element of capitalism and the most important things to fight. I have a long chapter discussing exactly this question in the book. My conclusion is different. I think we cannot avoid using market and price signals. It's impossible, and every experience shows that it's not viable, especially not in a modern complex economy with thousands and thousands of goods and services and primary and secondary. It's just not viable. So I think firstly, but I acknowledge that the market and its kind of anarchic structure has bad consequences. So what I suggest is that we should kind of diminish the role of market forces, and I suggest that we should do it in two ways. One, by decommodifying more areas of the economy. In Denmark, we would very much like to decommodify dental care, but it could also be public transportation, housing, Wi-Fi, telecommunication, and you can continue thinking. So that is one important way of doing us as persons less dependent on our purchasing power in fulfilling our most important needs. But so now we have an economy where the market forces only exist in certain part of the economy, and in that part of the economy we also need to kind of secure that market exchange and distribution is not kind of countering what we want to do with the economy. So that leads to your question of donut economy. I don't know if you know the British economist Kate Raworth. She did a really terrific book called Donut Economy. She's some kind of eco-socialist. So her idea of the donut was that today economy is kind of not taking into consideration neither the well-being of people nor the planetary boundaries. So what she proposed was that we need to create a government that stays inside the donut. So the inner circle was a kind of human needs, safety, security, education, food, all what we need to have a good life. And the outer circle was kind of the planetary boundaries. So what I suggest in the book is a kind of planning, but not the kind of Soviet Gosplan planning where you plant the details of every production, but a planning about what this economy should deliver and how it could be kept inside the donut. And it sounds really abstract, but I can give you one concrete example. The climate law that we passed in the Danish parliament. So the climate law set a clear goal of reducing carbon emission by 70% before 2030. And it seems now like we even will surpass this goal. So the climate law set this goal, and then the law kind of says that we need to go sector by sector to deliver on this emission reductions. And then we started to negotiate sector by sector by sector. Of course, we had a lot of political fights about it, but in the end, actually, we delivered. And we also did a climate council that kind of is an independent institution watching if the government is applying, delivering on the law. And if they're not, they need to take new actions. So, in my view, that is planning. That is democratic planning. That is using politics to decide what the economy should deliver. So imagine us doing that on all kind of questions. That could be a law for gender equality in wages, for example, saying we need to achieve wage, what do we call it, equality before 2035, and then you start reform by reform to achieve it. Or biodiversity law or equality law, we need to lower inequality in society as such to this Gini level before. And that would be a new way of dealing with the economy. And of course, that should be kind of based on broad democratic deliberations in order to decide on a democratic basis what the economy should deliver. So instead of this idea of planning all the economy down to the last workplace, this is an idea of kind of governing the frameworks and the direction of the economy. So that is kind of the two groups of reforms that are proposed in order to get towards a democratic economy. Is one, democratize ownership. Two, reduce market forces and their influence in our society. And the last half of the book is kind of all the concrete, I discussed the concrete reforms on how to do that with inspiration from mostly the Nordic countries and our experience.
All right, excellent. So got a good broad basis of what the book is about. Let's open it up to questions.
I think we have a microphone, so we're recording, so we would like to hear your question as well as the answer. So
I think we had the first hand I saw pop up was over here, and it's nothing against you folks over on this side.
I was kind of hoping that you could give us an example of one of these larger companies, like maybe if we could take Best Buy, which is kind of one of our local big companies, and how that you said something about they put 2% of their earnings toward a cooperative, I think, and then eventually the people who work for Best Buy would own Best Buy. How would that work?
What kind of company is Best Buy?
Oh, they're like
Retail.
technical TVs,
Okay.
phones, computers.
Okay, so if we should try to imagine the economy that we would want. So we would want Best Buy to deliver some of the same goods because we need them. So I don't know so much about Best Buy, but I would imagine that if they produce commodities like televisions, or not produce but sell, that we want that kind. So in a democratic economy, how should we organize that? Who should be the owners? Right now, maybe it's a capital fund. They drive up prices, they take out profits, and they try to lower wages and working conditions for the workers, because the ones in the top of this company, they are answering to the shareholders, not to other constituencies, not to the workers, not to the consumers. So how do we create a company that actually not only answers to the shareholders, but is kind of engulfed in the society as such? Who should be the owners? That's a good question, and that's a question we should ask sector for sector and company for company. So in my view, it would be a little bit strange if the state should own this kind of companies. It could, but I think learning from history, it's maybe not the best model. So I could see two kinds of ownership models. One could be a consumer ownership that we know from grocery chain stores. Actually, Mondragon, the Spanish company, they have this kind of electrodomésticos in Spanish, that is kind of the same kind of goods that is cooperatively owned by the workers. So it could be consumers or it could be the workers. So the next question is, how do we change ownership? Well, there's, of course, several ways. One is to do a new one. That was kind of what the cooperative movement in Denmark did. They made new grocery stores, and then the old ones was just outcompeted because they didn't need to deliver profits, so they could lower prices, and in the end, it kind of changed the price structures of the market. But then, of course, we have these big companies, and that is where we have this idea of funds, wage earner funds, and as the idea is that you make a tax on all big companies. Actually, Bernie Sanders did this proposal in his campaign, and they transfer shares to a fund. Do you call it a fund? A trust? A fund that is controlled by the workers working in the company. So 2% every year. After, I'm not a mathematician, but
2% the first year, then 4% the next year,
yeah,
6%
exactly.
next year, until 100% is owned by them.
You can discuss if you should stop at 51% or 40% or 60%. It's a democratic choice that you can make as a society. So you would transfer. It's a tax, but it's a special tax because you have to pay it in dividends. It's really not, and actually you could do it voluntarily. You could just put a really high tax of 5%, and then you could only pay 2% if you pay them as a share. So there are clever ways of doing it. There's other ways also of kind of giving workers more influence and power. I discussed a special proposal from a Belgian scholar, Isabella Ferreras, who suggested a two-chamber system in the governance of company. So she do not take away ownership, but she suggests changing the company code, to call it that, the laws governing how companies are governed. And she says, okay, the capital investors, they take a risk, so they should be represented in the leadership of the company. But the workers, they also take a risk. Actually, their risk is bigger because most shareholders spread the risk in 20 or 100 companies. But as a worker, you are on a company, you get special skills. And if the company shuts down, your risk is even greater. So her proposal is like the two-chamber system that you have here with the two political the bicameral system. So a worker council or a worker assembly and the shareholders, and all decisions should go through both chambers. And the leaders of the company, the executive, the CEO, should be kind of answering to both groups. And of course, that would fundamentally change power structures. And when I tell this in Denmark, some people are saying, "But can you just do that?" And I say yes, because the way companies are governed is not natural law. It's a company code. It's just it's how it's. So of course we can change that, and it would be correct to do it. Actually, we could do it tomorrow. It's just it's a simple change of laws. So that would be another way of changing ownership model. No, not ownership model, but governance model of a company.
They'd have to buy into it, though. They'd have to.
In that case, they didn't have to agree to it because company law is something we decide on a national level.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if we did the two-chamber system, it's just altering a little bit fundamentally how companies are governed. So today, it's only the shareholders who have a say, but it's not. It doesn't have to be that way. It's just a law saying that in a company, it's the shareholders who decide. and have the right to elect the CEOs and the leadership. But of course, you can change that.
Okay, we had another question over here.
Thank you very much for this illuminating presentation. I'm wondering how the oil industry meshes with this socialist model.
Okay, so from a strictly kind of economic model, economic perspective, I would say the natural resources should be owned by the state. So, and that's why it's important to discuss the different sectors. It would be crazy if the oil workers should be the owners of our national resources. So that kind of assets should be owned by the state. But of course, we need to get rid of oil as a source of energy because it destroys our planet, and that is totally possible. Right now, when you see how prices are developing, well, it's much cheaper to use. In Denmark, our electricity now is mostly renewables, wind, especially offshore, so we don't have to look too much at all this. I find them quite pretty, the wind turbines.
The turbines?
Yeah, the turbines. I like them, but sometimes some people don't like them. So it's good to get them out.
Well, according to Trump, they cause cancer in birds.
Yeah.
You know, so that's an issue.
Hi. So I was wondering, we're talking a lot about in the states that are nationalizing, getting more rights for the workers there. But here in the United States, like a lot of the labor that we, get a lot of value from doesn't happen here. So like with big multinational companies like Cargill, for example, like they get their profits using slavery and, deforestation and just these really horrible ethical practices. How would a change of ownership kind of change that for workers across the world and not just here?
That's a really important question. It's totally the same in Denmark. We have multinational, as you know, we have Maersk, who right now is one of the main providers of transportations for military equipment to Israel. We have strong movement against it, of course, that as you have here. I discuss it also in the book, only briefly, because of course the reforms that I suggest are mainly reforms that you carry through on a national level. But it's obvious that even, let's imagine, a totally democratized Danish economy or American economy, where at least the commanding heights of the economy are kind of democratically governed and owned, we would still be a part of a global trading system that is unfair and is based on some kind of unequal exchange that have been cleverly described by Samir Amin and other scholars. So my claim would be that if we don't have capitalist owners, the drive or the how do you call it? I think the machinery of the drive to try to exploit people in other parts of the world would not be the same. Maybe they wouldn't disappear because, of course, we know also a democratic economy would like to buy goods cheaply. But I think a worker-owned company would not go into the same kind of practices, for example, employing slave labor or child labor. I would imagine, at least I can see that the democratically owned companies in Denmark are in most instances, kind of pioneers when it comes to decarbonization, when it comes to fighting child labor, etc. So I think my model would not kind of take away any kind of domination in relations, but it would make it easier to do so by making new trade agreements, where when we are doing, I've been a part also of this kind of I was in Hong Kong when they had one of the last WTO rounds, and it's obviously that you have all these lobbyists, lobbyist is just another word for oligarchic power. But in the absence of oligarchic power, we wouldn't have these lobbyists to try to lobby bad trade agreements. So I think it would totally change kind of the momentum of the economy. And but yeah, I don't have all the answers to that question. So I think that future will need to show how long we can get in dismantling kind of the global unequal exchange by democratizing our economies. But of course, the idea of Nordic socialism or socialism as such is not something that shouldn't take place in the global south. So they should have the same process, and thereby also getting rid of their capitalists and democratizing their economies. And I'm sure that when we meet in the trade agreements from different democratic economies, the terms and the ways of doing it will be totally different from today. If not, you'll have to come and give me a harsh criticism.
We've got a couple here.
First of all, thank you very much for coming to the Heart of the Beast with some good news about what we can, how we can think about things that's more hopeful. And I hadn't actually, I was one of the ones who thought we kind of had to tear down the system. So to read your book, example after example, I mean, I'm part of a credit union. We have grocery co-ops in the United States. We have housing co-ops, and just to advance those that's hopeful that we can do that now. We don't have to wait for the system to be torn down. But I still want to tear down the system. So there, in our church, I belong to a church in Minneapolis called Creekside United Church of Christ, and we've been studying the role of indigenous spirituality and how that relates to capitalism, going back to the doctrine of discovery and the whole idea that if lands were not occupied by Christians, that then Europeans could take that land, and that still is good law in the United States, by the way. Right now, it's been quoted by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a justice on the United States Supreme Court not that many years ago. So Sarah Augustine, who is an indigenous leader in the West Coast of the United States, has kind of stated what she thinks is the root of all problems with the whole global economic system, and especially predatory capitalism. She says the problem is that we've created a system that can only continue to go on to the extent that rich countries continue to steal resources from particularly indigenous people in the United States and also around the world, that it cannot continue. And it's that system that is also creating climate change, and it's also frying the planet. And it's based on consumption, it's based on a false spirituality. And so I'm wondering if you agree with that. If she says the whole problem is that the capitalistic system is based on stealing resources from other people, whether it's workers, whether it's land in other countries, whether it's extractive industries, mining in Guatemala or the Philippines, that's the core, and that unless we're aware of that and we pay attention to that, we can't do any of the things that we want to do that are in your book. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think it's obvious that we're stealing from other parts of the world through this kind of unequal exchange. That kind of, but I do not think that capitalism couldn't exist without that. I think if you capitalism could exist in the United States without interaction with the rest of the world, it would be less wealthy. But capitalism, American workers are exploited too. They are not stealing; they are being stolen from. So of course you have, through this unequal exchange, that workers in some countries have better conditions than in others, and that is not only to do with productivity, it has also to do with an unfair, unequal exchange, as described by Sami Amin and other Marxist scholars. But so I would say capitalism could exist without this, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to fight it. So it's a little bit the same that goes for kind of gender oppression and racism and so on. I think capitalism could exist without it, but that doesn't mean that it is not kind of domination, oppression that we as progressive should fight. Then comes the idea of the system. And I'm a little bit, as I said earlier, I think we should be a little bit aware of this kind of broad definitions where we put everything in the world into one definition of a system that is kind of coherent and organic. The system does something, or capitalism does this, and capitalism does this. Only humans do things. Systems cannot do things. They need people getting up in the morning and doing special things in order to exist. So the idea, it's not because capitalism is a system. We feel it, we need to go to work because we need to pay our rent or our mortgage, and in that way we are kind of in a kind of claustrophobic system. But we're also here right now, and we're not here because we don't think so, want to get some kind of network so we can get a better job. Or I think we're here because we maybe because of the kind of spirituality, because we need to, we want to learn, we want to engage with each other. So we also, capitalism is not, the system is not kind of everywhere, it's not dominating every space. We have spaces outside, also in the economy. So it's also because if we just say we need to get rid of the system, or we need to abolish capitalism, the task is so immense that we don't know how to start. And so some leftists would call me a reformist, and that's not good enough what I'm saying, and so on. And that's totally okay. I will not kind of block their way from more what do you call it, to overthrow a system. I just think that we need to analyze how do we take the first step in order to change power relations. So what is most important, I think, is to try to ask all the bad things that happens in the world. Who are taking the decisions, and where do the power those people have come from? And my answer to that would be that this power lays in ownership of our productive apparatus, our productive assets. And therefore, the best way to counter this and to be able to make ourselves able to change this bad decision is by democratizing ownership. So when left-wing or progressive forces gets to power, we should not only thinking about redistributing. I think it's terrific with free school meal, but we should really think about how to take steps that changed, that kind of moves economic power from oligarchic power to democratic power. And yeah, as I said, I have a lot of suggestions on that in the book.
Thank you for being here. You mentioned kind of taking political power. So on that note, I'm wondering if you could comment in the current political climate that you operate in, what's sort of your game plan for adding more power or taking back power, if you will? And maybe if you could comment on our political landscape here in the U.S., leftists, if you will, are in a bit of wilderness, and centrists are the least popular. Like congressional Democrats are even less popular than Republicans, which is kind of wild to think about. But what is our path forward if we can lump ourselves all together as non-MAGA?
You have a big responsibility. You know, right now, the whole world are looking to what is going on in the US. The Danish media, they are, and population, were totally kind of fixated on everything Trump does and says, because, of course, the influence that it has on all of us. So you really need to build an alternative that is able to win, and that is able to take political power. And is that possible? Yes, I think it is. What happened in New York was, of course, extremely hope-giving with Zoran Mamdani. You know, he was challenged by all that kind of oligarchic power. They used millions of these negative ad campaigns. I think in every single New Yorker received this leaflet saying that he was a dangerous socialist. I don't know if socialist is so dangerous for people anymore in the US, and still he won by a big margin. And I think that shows that as you say here, you know, organized people can beat organized money, and that is really hope-giving. But of course, winning the presidential election is another thing. But I think it's possible. You know, if you look to Chile, for example, you had a left-wing candidate, and you have several candidates in the presidential election. In the last round, there were only two. The left-wing candidate, Boric, that is kind of from our sister party, so it's quite left-wing, and then this right-wing populist Antonio Cast, fascist type. And the left won because a lot of the kind of middle-class voters, they preferred the left from the hard right. So you need a candidate and a movement behind that candidate that is as strong on a national level as a movement that brought Mamdani to his victory. We visited New York only a week ago and met with Mamdani's organizers and a lot of the people who were canvassing. And of course, the DSA played an important role. So it's hope-giving that you have a kind of left-wing socialist group that is growing. We were at the convention yesterday and the day before, and it was, of course, really something that made me happy to be with 1,500 American democratic socialists. But it's also quite obvious that it's a young party that really needs also to get their things together. You know, the left is really good at fighting itself, and right now, you know, kind of fascism or quasi-fascism is marching, and we really need to take ourselves a little bit more serious and to create the movement, even with the compromise that's necessary. Even we need a majority, but I think, and we need to accept that some of our policies we will not kind of get a majority behind it. So we need to focus on the policy issues like Mamdani did. Affordability mainly, rents, grocery prices, public transportation, welfare issues, minimal wage, in order to form this broad alliance of people that gets hope. We drove with a taxi driver the other day in Chicago, and he said he was, I think he had Arab background, and he voted for Trump. And he said no, but he promised to get down the prices, but of course he was just a liar. And then I asked him, who are your favorite politician now? I don't have any. I don't believe politician anymore. So we need a character that people can believe in and that they believe will deliver on what is important in their daily lives. So yeah, but it's a big task. But and you know, all the discussion about should you go through the Democratic Party or should you form a different party. I'm not enough into American policies to say what is the right thing to do. But I think it is interesting to see that Trump succeeded in taking over a party and changing kind of the content of that party to something else. And maybe it would be possible to do the same with the Democratic Party. But I'm sure you're much wiser than me in that aspect and many other aspects as well.
So I see that it is 8:30. I don't know if you are ready to mingle or if we could do another quick question or
It's a side clearance. We don't have a strict. So if there's someone burning question, so
I don't know. Burning question?
let's take the two questions and then
Yeah, we'll do them quick.
Just a quick question. I really thank you for the facilitation too. It was really great. It allowed us to get inside the book. So I have a question about changing the system, changing society, changing structure. I think it requires changing ourselves too. So in what ways? So this is the two-sided kind of a transformation that I've learned from Grace Lee Boggs, who's a great Chinese-American philosopher and activist and revolutionary, but she makes this kind of a proposition that two-sided transformation, that we need self-structure transforming actions, that they have to be linked up. But listening to this conversation, I always get kind of uneasy because we end up stressing too much emphasis on structure, governance. These concepts like governance, ownership, kind of gets in a way, so it becomes in many ways like a filter, and then kind of clouds the self, or just takes away the self. And that's why I appreciated the interjection about indigenous sort of perspectives and indigenous philosophy. And I think that for me has informed the way I think about my place in this world, that I'm a settler, I'm a visitor to this land. And that optic changes the way I come to this world, or how I relate to the land or relate to everything around. So you talk about decommodification and all that stuff. So through that lens, I begin to think differently about myself. So I'm just questioning about you and your book, and whether that self, it's a philosophical question, but whether self is integrated in overall analysis about the system change. So that's a big question, but that's my question.
Well, again, I think the Danish word is tak for being here. Okay, so I was live streaming the DSA convention. I'm a member. And it seems that there are certain elements of the left that are very hard, ideological, even rigid in some ways. Is it different in Denmark? Is there more a sense of pragmatism, but still holding on to principles?
Let's start with the last one. Yes, I think that there's a difference. It doesn't mean that we don't have kind of small communist groups or parties that kind of criticizes my party or any other party, but they are not really strong and they are not dominating. And of course, in my party, we also have discussions, because that's why it needs to be in a democratic party. But I think the experience of having power that all many European Parliament socialist parties have is kind of changing a little bit. You know, you need to learn to compromise and still standing on your principles. So that's a difficult balance, of course. And I think maybe sometimes if you're in a position where you actually don't think that you will ever get power, then it's easier to turn to this purism that is kind of a little bit dominant on parts of the DSA, in my view, without judging anything. So the Nordic and the European left wing, we have kind of what we call the modern left. That is all the big left-wing parties like Podemos in Spain and France Insoumise in France, Bloco in Portugal, Die Linke in Germany, the Nordic left-wing parties. So we work together in a newly formed European party called the European Left Alliance for the People and the Planet. And I think all those parties kind of have gone a little bit beyond the very dogmatic and purism. So I really hope that the DSA will be able to develop and to kind of go from to mature a little bit more. And the problem is that they really need to do it fast but then of course you have a different system here because they are not running as a party. So they do campaigns, but the campaign strategies are not made in the DSA. It's made by the campaign around for example, Mamdani or Bernie Sanders. So they can't influence it that much, and that's maybe until this maturing of the parties, maybe not that bad. Maybe I'm not wanting to offend anyone, and I think really there are a lot of good comrades in the DSA, and I'm really inspired by a lot of people, and I cite them in the book. But I'm just really feeling that you have such responsibility right now in the US because you're kind of having the world destiny in your hands. So it's a little bit concerning to see people use at times in internal quarrels about details right now, when the world is as it is. Oh, your question. It's also it's a good question, and the kind of this balance between the structural and the individual or the human. I think it's kind of a dualism. Sometimes people say to me, no, but you can have a welfare state in the Nordic countries because you have a lot more trust in government, for example, and lots more trust in your neighbor. And that's right. If you look to the numbers, the Nordic countries is far beyond the US when you talk about trust in institution, trust in politicians, trust in your neighbors. But my argument would be that it's the other way around. It was not because we had trust that we had the welfare society. It's the welfare society creating this trust. So in that way, structures is important to form our ways of being. When we are afraid, I think and then I think it's really important, and therefore it's a good question. Sometimes socialists, we talk about that if socialism is kind of the goal in itself, but so socialism, or we could call it democratization of the economy, is just a mean to the goal, and the goal is of course a fulfillment of human beings as free individuals, able to use their skills and their sensitivities and all that kind of stuff, and that is important to stress. You have a point in sometimes, maybe also I and a lot on the left, we are talking a lot about institutions and ways of organizing instead of what is the goal of everything. And of course, the goal of everything is to make a life great and free and happy and safe and secure for all humankind.
I think I want to step back and correct a fundamental thing that I didn't do. What brought you to your current political thinking? Like what made the person that has written the book? Was it personal experience? Was it family? Yeah, I mean, was it you got messed over on a job? I mean, like what brought you to this point right now in your political development?
No, well, as I wrote the book because I needed the answers myself. Actually, it was obvious for me that the actual system that the way we organize production and society today is not viable. And I think it's obvious to more and more people. You always also see that in the data. For example, young people in the United States prefer socialism over capitalism in the polls. But then, so it's quite easy to argue against capitalism. But we really have been really bad at providing a viable alternative. And socialism has just become some kind of utopia or slogan. And so I really had to question myself, if I call myself a socialist, I also need to be able to deliver on it and to answer all the hard questions that this ideas raises. So it was in some kind just also a kind of self-therapy to be able to deliver on this. But of course, it was the end of a long process of thought. I have been an activist all my life. I'm born into a family of trade unionists and progressives, and and then actually the idea of kind of this Nordic socialism, as I said, and maybe we should end on that. It actually was an impulse from you guys, or from the US, because we had this Fox News anchor called Trish Regan. Maybe you remember her, and she made this in Denmark very famous rant, where she was talking about Denmark and how terrible a system it was, because it was socialism and we had high taxes, and she ended by saying, and we had free education, and we even paid the young people to go to university and to educate themselves. And then she said, but you know what happened? No one wants to work. Everyone just wants to make cupcakes. And then ending, that is a reality of socialism. And then I think 1 month after, the Trump administration published a report called The Opportunity Cost of Socialism. And of course, it was chapters on China and everything. But there was also a chapter on the Nordic countries arguing against our welfare models. And he used the term Nordic socialism. I had never heard the term before. I thought, okay, that should be the title for my book. And then of course, all that was a kind of response to what was going on the American left with Bernie Sanders and AOC and other bright politicians pointing to the Nordics as an inspiration for their democratic socialism. And the funny thing was that in Denmark, everyone was saying, hell no, we're not a socialist country. Maybe we have some welfare, but we're not socialist. Even the left was saying so.
And we don't even like cupcakes.
Actually, it was totally rubbish what Trish Regan was saying, because our rate of employment is way higher in Denmark than it is in the US. But so that was kind of the impulse of thinking, okay, but maybe they have made a point. Maybe we have some kind of socialist elements in our economy, and that was kind of what led me to. That was an impulse leading me to look closer at the economy and developing this idea of economies as hybrid. So, and now of course I'm totally excited that it's out in the US. It was out in Sweden and Finland as well. But if I can just make a tiny contribution to the other America that is kind of fighting against oligarchy and ICE agents chasing immigrants, and that are trying to create an alternative. If my arguments can just contribute a little bit to those people trying to do this, I will be forever happy.
I think there are few books. This book has been so popular that it has been hard to keep it in print. So happy problem is often how we describe that. Not so much for those of us who are former booksellers, but it is the way it is. But there are a few books. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Continue this conversation this evening, but also outside. And hopefully we will see oh gosh, I'm blanking on the title of the event that we have on September 18th. I don't know. It's on the 18th. Just look it up. Five poets, the Cracked Walnut Reading Festival, writers for Democratic Action, I think is what they are called. Is that it? All right, thank you. So, oh yes, yes, there is going to be a Labor Day picnic. I think it is the Saturday before Labor Day, but we do not have the information from the labor working group yet to post it. But yes, there will be a Labor Day picnic. That. Right. So it'll be the weekend before the day. Yeah, the weekend before the day. So yes, the same weekend. Well, wait a minute. No, I take that back. You're gonna have to sign up for the newsletter. Because we can't have it on Labor Day weekend. So look at your newsletter. Look at our website. We have an events page on our website. Look at that. Okay. But yeah, listen for more word on that. Anyway, thanks again, and hopefully see you in not too long.